Okay, so welcome everyone to this new event by the Cañada-Blanch Centre here at the LSE with the Department of Geography and Environment. I'm your host, I'm Vernon, and today we have the huge pleasure of having Dijkstra, who is a visiting professor of practice at LSE, and he's the head of the Territorial Urban Analysis at the Joint Research Centre. Who's going to be talking about what can we learn from an emerging global definition of urbanization. Just to give you a few highlights of his biography. Before he moved recently to the Joint Research Centre, which is the research division of the European Commission, he was editor of the Cohesion Report. So many of you have been familiar with the work he has been doing over the years, which mainly goes and analyzes economic, social, and environmental issues in the EU regions and cities. He has worked closely with a lot of international organizations, the OECD. I think probably the OECD has worked closely with you more than the other way around. The UN, the World Bank, the European Environmental Agency, and he's a prolific researcher. So you can be in international organizations and still do research. And he has been publishing on topics that are rather controversial, like the one he's going to talk today about the global definition of cities, measuring transport performance, the geography of EU discontent, where we have collaborated quite a lot, and quality of government. He has been the main promoter of the quality of government index that now many of us have been using, and gender equality. Most important parts of his biography: he holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and even more importantly, he has an MSc in urban and regional planning from the London School of Economics. So he did RUPS. Well, it's many years, but I think we worked together. I'm not sure whether they taught you or not, but possibly. You never know. That time was my first year when you were here, so it's a long time ago. And he's got a BA in political science from the University of Ghent in Belgium. He's going to be, his presentation is going to be discussed by, I don't think it needs any introduction, Professor Vernon Henderson, who's sitting over here, who is the school professor in economic geography and has been in the school since 2013, after having been for many years Eastman Professor of Political Economy at Brown University in the US, who's one of the most cited and best known academics or researchers in the field of urban economics, with a lot of focus of his research on issues related to urbanization in developing countries, both across cities and regions. So without further ado, Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting to be the discussant. I want to give you a quick overview of how we've developed a global definition of urbanization and also what we can learn from that. Right? I want to move beyond just explaining the process, but start to see if we can see some emerging messages coming out of this. And I'll show you some of the trickier decisions that we had to make while developing this definition. So I'll give you a short introduction on the methodology. It's all online, properly documented, so I'll go quite quickly. But I'll explain you a little bit how we developed it and how we are implementing it as we speak. And then I'm going to focus on three things where I wanted to dig in a bit deeper. You know, what are we learning from this? What is driving urbanization? We'll talk about migration there. What is its link to economic development? And finally, how have cities changed over time? And actually, on all these topics, what I'm going to be presenting clashes with some of the established findings, clashes with some of the dominant rhetoric out there, and I'll try and explain you how we get there. So this is not my definition. It's not something I dreamt up. This is something that we've been doing together with 6 international organizations, and we also have done an incredibly wide consultation. We started this work back in 2016, and you can see the organizations that are participating in this there on top. We got UN Habitat, FAO, OECD, World Bank, and ILO. And the goal was to test whether a definition that we had developed in Europe, with at least 30 countries participating in it, whether it could work outside Europe. And my expectation was that we'd have to change it substantially, but that it could work. And so we consulted 85 countries outside Europe. So this is consulting more than half of the countries in the world. And to my surprise, they said, no, you don't really have to change it. It works quite well. We're still consulting, we're still implementing, we're making small tweaks. But overall, their feedback was this really reflects our cities, our towns, and our villages very, very well. So you can see here all the workshops that we did together with UN Habitat. We also had an expert meeting in New York with the UN Statistical Division. And finally, it was endorsed in 2020 after 4 years of a lot of running around and talking to people. So now we have a manual that was published 2021. It's available in English, French, and Spanish. And we also generated a lot of automatic, free tools so they can easily apply it, aimed at both academics, but also statistical offices. Now, why does this definition work better? And I say better because a number of countries have said this one works better than our national definition. We want to replace our national definition with this one. And so I see six big benefits. And the first one is really that we started with a new statistical tool. It's called a population grid. Back when we started in 2011, this was very novel. And for me, the benefit of this is a harmonized spatial resolution. You get little squares of 1 kilometer that have the same shape and size everywhere in the globe. Whereas if you work with municipalities, they differ within countries, they differ across countries, and even if you use the same threshold, you will get different results in different places because the boundaries change. I've tried to visualize that here by showing 2 small settlements in the Netherlands here. You see clearly 2 spatial clusters of population. And here, this one you can see, it has a higher density, and this one disappears because it's part of this larger municipality. So if you don't work with the grid, you really can't see urbanization very well. The other benefit is that we have a very simple, if you want to say one-dimensional or thin definition of urbanization. Urbanization is the concentration of people in space. That's it. Very simple. Other people think of it as a more sophisticated or more multi-dimensional. They don't want just people living closely together. They also want them to be affluent, or they want to have them to have a particular lifestyle, or the economy should have a different structure. None of that. We're just measuring, do people live close together? Some people use buildings as a proxy for the population clusters. Now, the problem with that is that doesn't work very well, because in some countries, the same number of people live in very small buildings, and in other countries, think of the US, they live in massive buildings. So if you use buildings as a proxy for population, the results are not very easy to compare. And because we start with these very same grid cells, we can use the same size and density thresholds across the globe. We'll see, also in the discussion, there's quite a bit of debate about whether this is useful or a good idea. But the feedback we get from the countries is that for them, this is incredibly useful. The other thing we're trying to do is step away from a dichotomy, either you're entirely urban or entirely rural. That never really reflected the situation very well. So we try and come up with a continuum of settlements. So we look at cities like Lagos, towns, and villages in a harmonized manner. So we really have a sequence of all settlements. Not all areas are considered settlements, but these we try and capture. Another thing that we try and avoid is, because this was done to help the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, what share of the rural population has access to water, what share of the city population has access to electricity, et cetera, et cetera. If you mix those type of services into your definition, then you can no longer monitor them, right? You don't want to, all cities by definition have access to electricity. You can't monitor access to electricity in cities, because it's 100%, always. And the same is actually true for income. If you want to measure rural poverty, your definition of rural should not have an income dimension. Otherwise you get this conflict, right? And the last thing, it's actually pretty cheap. I mean, I call it cost cost effective, it's a nice word, but it's not very expensive to implement. You can find free tools. If you have a recent census, you can do a decent job of estimating a population grid, and the results are quite robust. So briefly on the definition, we define cities by urban centers, and urban centers are very simple. 1,500 residents per square kilometer of the cells. You glue all the cells together, and you check if you have 50,000 inhabitants. That's it. It fits on the back of a napkin. I can explain it to policymakers, politicians, and they get it. It's also brutally simplistic, but the fact is that we have tested this with countries, asked, are these your cities? And the resounding answer we get is yes. There might be some discussion about how far that city extends, but this, the places we identify are clearly to them cities. Then we have urban clusters, same principle, cells above 300 inhabitants per square kilometer, contiguous cells at least 5,000. These define a mixture of places. We have some towns in there, we also some semi-dense areas. The remaining cells tend to have a lower density, they're in the rural cells. We apply it in 2 steps. First, we apply it to the grid, which is my favorite level. And then we apply it to the statistical unit level, small spatial units. It can be municipalities or enumeration areas. Why do we do that? It's not because this is better than that, but because here we have much more data. We might know more about the people who live there. We might know more about how much money gets spent there. We might know how many poor people live there. And so to be able to get this data, we have to translate that into this. As long as these units are small, it works very, very well. And so it's done based on the majority share of your population. Majority is in urban center, you're in city. Majority in rural, you're rural, and the rest is in between. We do define urban because it's kind of hard not to, right? If you're trying to define urban. But I'm not a big fan of it because otherwise you get urban and rural. That's a dichotomy we're trying to get away. But in principle, if you combine cities, towns, and semi-dense, you have urban. But I rarely use that because I think it's more interesting to see what's in between the extremes. And working with FAO, they said, okay, we don't have that much population in the rural areas, but depending on the country, we might have 80 or 90% of all land. So they felt like from that point of view, we need a bit more differentiation. So with them, we tried to create a subclassification. So we have villages, dispersed and very dispersed areas. And we tried to split the towns from the suburban and peri-urban areas. We're still discussing the definition of some of the towns, and we've got a new proposal there coming out soon. But this is the current situation with the thresholds I mentioned, and we have 2 types of towns, dense towns and semi-dense towns. And the rural clusters are the villages, and these are not part of settlements efficient. Now, first we did a pairwise comparison. We took all the national definitions that are, dichotomies, urban or rural, and we compared them to what we found in 2015. This is based on the latest GHSO release that came out last year. And we find in some places, Europe, the Americas, little black bar is what they say is their urban share, and it looks very similar to the cities and towns and semi-dense. And you have some other places like Africa, it's much closer just to cities. And then here, it's a bit mixed. Sometimes it includes some of the towns, sometimes it doesn't. Same graph, but broken down, level 2. Again, you can see that even here in Europe, some of the villages are even included in urban by the national definitions. Here, quite close to cities, towns, and suburbs. And here you see sometimes towns are clearly considered urban, whereas in Africa, it's mostly the cities. Now, it really shows that national definitions compared to the degree of urbanization are incredibly different, right? And here we tried to classify countries according to what their national definition looks like. So if you look at the US, for example, it typically includes everything villages and up. Whereas the red countries, India, but also large countries in Africa, it's typically cities only. and the rest is a bit of a mixture in between. So even within continents, you can have countries with very narrow definitions of urban and sometimes very expansive definitions of urban. Now this is new, and I'm quite excited about it. Rather than doing a pairwise comparison, we did an intersection. So we did a crosstab. So for each spatial unit, we asked, is it classified as rural or urban by the national definition? And how is it classified by the degree of urbanization? And we did this for 80% of the global population. So we're really covering almost all the countries in the world. And what do you see? You see that for cities, typically all of it is urban, or almost all of it is urban. A little bit of difference. When you look at towns and semi-dense, you see that really differs. Here, almost all of it is urban. Here, it's much more likely to be rural. But you also see some of the towns keep popping up in urban. So clearly, towns does capture something that's also present in most national definitions. And so globally, you see, we agree on cities being urban, rural is rural. It's this bit in the middle where people get, in conflict. And that also expressed in the threshold. Some countries say you have to have 50,000 or 100,000 to be urban. Others say 5,000, 1,000. Denmark even says 200 is enough to be urban. So no wonder we can't agree in this bit in the middle. It's because the definitions are so different. So for me, using the data published by the UN Urban Rural, the World Urbanization Prospect, you can do it, but it's not very comparable. And it's not even because the statistical definitions are different. It's because most countries don't even have a statistical definition. They just look at their country and say, these are my 5 cities, basta, and they're done. It's a very efficient and fast way of defining your cities, but it's not something that you can replicate. 10 years later, do you have a new city? How would I know? If you want to apply it to a different country, how would you do that? You just simply can't. So designations cannot be replicated, cannot be compared. They're not statistical definitions. But even for the statistical definition, we get different spatial units, different indicators, different thresholds, and also the concepts are different. Are we looking at the city center? Are we looking at an agglomeration? Are we looking at a metropolitan area? Also, that has a big impact. And the UN currently, in its recommendations for housing and population censuses, recommends including these other indicators about economic structure and access to services that we explicitly avoid, deliberately avoid, because otherwise it's so hard to isolate the impact on economic development for access to services. The other thing that we really wanted, if your definition of urban is a concentration of people in space, if you become more urban, right, you need a higher concentration of people in space. Now, by only looking at that, we make sure that whenever a country becomes more urban, we get a bigger concentration. But if you have a very concentrated population, but a lot of them working agriculture, you can have a change in the economic structure without a change in the underlying spatial distribution of your population, meaning that all of a sudden you become more urban. But nobody lives any closer to anybody else, right? So that for me is another reason why we've opted for a very narrow definition or simple definition of urban. When it comes to academic definitions, I've had the joy of many long discussions without any clear conclusion. But let me give you my take. So some of the people have worked on built-up area, right? It's all the Angels Atlas of Urban Expansion, also World Settlement Footprint. It's relatively straightforward. You use remote sensing data, you get a grid with built-up areas for the entire globe, and you create a couple of simple rules about how you do them together. The difficulty I have with that approach is that it over-urbanizes rich countries. Rich countries have large buildings. People live in big houses, they work in big offices, they go to big shopping malls, they have big factories and warehouses. They're not rich because their houses are big. Their houses are big because they're rich, right? So I don't want to include that in the definition of urban, because otherwise you would automatically have a positive correlation with economic growth, right? Because you're cherry picking the rich countries by emphasizing the ones that have big buildings. We've opted for something which has absolute thresholds. We get a lot of flack for that, a lot of criticism. People claim they're random. Trust me, they're not random. I didn't flip a coin, right? They accuse me of it being arbitrary. If you consult more than half of the countries on multiple thresholds, I don't think arbitrary really captures that, but we keep hearing the same criticism. Relative definitions, for me, are quite difficult to explain to somebody else, and I don't fully grasp what the benefit is. Now, here are two examples of dartboard method by Vernon. They randomly select places, and then based on the pattern that they find, they select a different threshold in each area that they apply this method to. Which is a long way of saying, if you apply the method to New York City, you'll get one result. If you apply it to New York State, you'll get a different result for New York City. If you apply it to the US, again, you'll get a different result for New York City, which is odd. For me, a city is something quite clearly defined, and it should be stable regardless of what your reference area is. And this explicitly and deliberately doesn't want to do that. There was a recent paper in Nature Cities, again, advocating not picking thresholds, having machines generating thresholds, and picking relative thresholds. For me, another problem with this is that if you pick relative thresholds in the way that the Vernon does, you pick a rural country, you're going to make it more urban, because you're not going to find a lot of urban, so their method reduces the threshold. If you apply it to a very urban place, it's going to make it more rural. So this method deliberately makes Singapore more rural. I don't know why that's attractive, but hopefully I'll learn more about that later. I mentioned spatial concepts, and here I've compared the cities with at least 30,000 inhabitants, looking at their national definitions. In red and the blue, the degree of urbanization. Now, I've highlighted two parts of the world, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, where we find a big discrepancy between what is reported by the UN and what we come up with. And the difference is in the spatial concept that they are trying to measure with their national definition. They focus on urban agglomerations, so cities plus contiguous suburbs. That does two things. It adds more population to the cities that we've identified, and it adds more agglomeration to that city list, because they apply that threshold to their agglomerations and not their cities. We're now developing agglomerations. I'm very curious to see whether we'll come closer to these results. But the general message is that usually, plus or minus some percentage points, we actually agree on how many people live in cities over 300,000. So what do we have in the degree of urbanization? We have a dense urban sediment in the city itself. We have a metropolitan area, city plus commuting zone. We also call it functional urban area. We have towns, we have villages, but we don't have city plus suburbs. So that's something we're still developing. We don't have towns plus suburbs. And sometimes you have a conglomerate of cities. So two towns close to each other, two cities close to each other. You would kind of want to group them. So we're also doing this in a two-step process. We're looking at suburbs and assigning them to a city or a town. And then the second step, if two towns or a city and a town are close together, we're combining them in conglomerations. We're also finding other bits. Not all the suburbs are easy to allocate, and this is what they call in the US ex-urban. So it's a distant, non-contiguous suburban residential area. Now, for the implementation, we did a lot of consultation prior to the endorsements of the UN Statistical Commission. Right now, we're funding individual country workshops with UN Habitat, 24 countries. We're doing in-person regional workshops with the Statistical Division. We're doing online seminars with UNFPA. They're going to help 15 countries with their census and integrating the degree of urbanization. There's a whole much more support coming. By the end of this, my hope is that we would have 50 to 100 countries that know how to implement the degree of urbanization. We're already above 50, and with this additional work, I think we can get even higher. In addition to helping countries implement it, we're also trying to get people to produce more data. UNICEF has a survey called MIX that they're going to break down by degree of urbanization. World Bank has a LSMS survey, which will break down by degree of urbanization. It'll make it easier for countries to produce that data. Now, so far, the first part of my story about the definition and its implementation. Let me tell you a little bit about the three topics that I wanted to focus on learning. So, what drives urbanization? A lot of you will have heard from rural to urban migration, right? That's the classic story. But back in 1965, Davis in a seminal paper said, yes, but there's more to population change at the city level than natural change and net migration. There's a missing component, which is the reclassification. So rather, here you see Cairo, show in blue the boundary of 1980, and in green, all the places that were added to it by 2020. And so you can see all these places, when they got added to the city, there were already people there. And those people didn't change where they lived, but they used to live in the countryside or in a town or a suburb, and all of a sudden now they're part of the city. Now, if you look at the data published by the UN, you get a point for Cairo, tells you where it is, very useful. Sometimes it's in the ocean, but well, you usually find where the city is. And it gives you two numbers, population in 1980, population in 2020. Zero boundaries, no information about whether the definition has been reapplied, no information about what the boundaries, if the boundaries have changed, and if so, by how much. So it's very difficult from these two numbers to actually break it down into those three different components. What happens if you ignore reclassification? So basically, let's take Shanghai, right? We have estimated boundaries 1980 and 2020. Typically, what you do, you subtract the population in the most recent year, you take the most recent year population and you subtract the previous population. But that means that you're only considering in your initial population, the population here, right? And so that population is allowed to change through natural change, for instance. But all the population that was living here at the time is ignored because it's not part of that boundary. So what happens, we underestimate natural change and we overestimate net migration. And so that really means we get a big overestimation of the impact of net migration on urbanization. In addition to, well, reclassification as annexation is when parts get added to an existing city. You can also have new cities. You know, typically you have a town, it's 40,000 inhabitants, it grows to 50,000, it becomes a city. And so the number of cities between 1980 and 2020 almost doubled, from 7,500 to 11,500. But typically they're very small, right?
Just one question for clarification. Is this according to your definition?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. That's the only one I have boundaries for.
Okay.
I did manage to get boundaries for one point in time for urban rural, but not for individual cities. And here you need boundaries over time to do this, right? And so by 2020, one of the 6 city residents lived in a place that only became a city after 1980. So this is why reclassification is difficult, is because you don't necessarily get multiple boundaries. You also only get a population for each boundary, not for different boundaries. And you need populations for the changes in the boundary. You need to know how many people were living in that part that was added, right? And so you don't have spatial boundaries, you don't even have one, let alone two. You don't know what the definition is. And because if you use statistical boundaries, they change over time. Census enumeration areas, municipalities, they're not stable, they keep changing. So you cannot even go back in time with the same boundary set, because for each census it's different. So this is what the UN publishes in the World Urbanization Prospect. I think it's the best effort, right? It's the biggest data collection out there, but it's very difficult to use because you only get a dot, you don't get a boundary, and you just get a population for each point in time. So how did we do it? First of all, you need multiple boundaries. So you need changing boundaries over time. You need a time series for population for all the different boundaries and their differences. And then you have a choice. You have a couple of choices to make about what to do with the population in the areas that were added, right? Think of Cairo or Shanghai. When do we consider that change to happen? If we compare 2 points in time, you can take the population that was living in the area that were added later in the initial year, and then you're going to underestimate the impact of classification. You can do it in the final year, right? 1980 or in 2020, but by 2020, it's been a city, part of the city for a long time. So you overestimate the impact of reclassification. You can kind of take the average between the two, and it's maybe not too low and maybe not too high, but it's maybe still wrong. I think the best option is to take the population in the year that the classification changed. We've estimated changes every 5 years, so we could pick the closest 5 years. What does that mean for the results? So here we take the total population that changed, and then we break it down into natural change, internal migration, and reclassification. And we compare 2 points in time. The first year, 1980, or year 2000, 2020, and the entire period. So obviously, if you take it at the end of the period, it's much bigger. If you take it at the start of the bigger period, it's still very big. It explains 25% of change, growth in city population. It's much bigger than internal migration. The little blue line is international migration. It barely matches for most places, except the high countries. So this is really important. What happens if you take it at the end, you actually get negative internal migration because this becomes so big. But the key thing here to remember is that internal movement is not what is driving global changes in the urban population. It is primarily natural change, followed by reclassification. One last point here, because we used the two extremes, it doesn't add up. And if you would use the population on the year that it's changed, it would add up and you would get the same results for sub-periods as you would get for the entire. So, going into too much detail. So we've assumed that international migration is identical across the 3 degrees of urbanization. That really doesn't matter, except in high-income countries where we probably underestimate the impact of net international migration. And this is the formula for net internal migration. Population in the final year, in the final boundary, population in initial year, initial boundary, and this is the hard part. You need the population, you need to apply natural change to the population in the final boundary, but for the initial year. So take the population in the final boundary, and then you apply natural change to the population in the initial year. That's why you need the intersection between the boundaries. And then reclassification, you can take the population in the initial year or final year, or year changed, and then net migration, you just calculate that at the national level and apply it. That's how we do it. So natural change, we don't have it by degree of urbanization. So you have to decide what it's going to be, right? Is it going to be the same? No difference. Is it going to be much higher in cities than in rural areas? In this scenario, cities, it's almost In rural areas, it's double that of cities. Or we have an estimate of imputed difference where we take into account the share of population with low education. What happens if we assume no difference in terms of natural change? Net migration becomes smallest. We make a big difference, net migration becomes a bit more important. This is probably the most plausible scenario, and here we've organized it by UN income groups. No difference everywhere shows a relatively small impact of net migration, with the biggest one still being natural change and reclassification. Here, the middle one, especially in the low and the middle income countries, net migration becomes more important, right? And we see also the negative impact here of international migration. But even with these different assumptions of natural change, the main factor is natural change, and it's not net migration. So, long story short, if you want to stop cities growing, don't try and stop people moving there. It's much more about how many babies people. In a previous paper, we estimated population back to 1975 and looked on the impact of economic growth. Now, together with the UN Pop Division, we estimated it back to 1950. And so here you can see the figures for the World Bank income groups. You can clearly see a much higher population growth rates in the lower middle income groups, and the tapering off population growth in the upper middle and the high. And you can see a lot of growth here in the blue. Here it's an absolute. Here you can see the relative. And you can see even the starting point for high income is much higher than, say, upper middle or low. You still see a very big dominance of rural population and low income as compared to this. So we have a simple definition. We ignore whether people have higher incomes in cities. We ignore whether these places have a different economic structure. So now my question was, does it still have an impact on economic development? Because we stripped out a lot of things that could influence that. And the short answer is it does. Here we've just done a pairwise comparison, 5-year intervals, share of urban population on your left, share of city population on your right, compared to GDP, real GDP per head for those 5-year intervals, starting 1950 up to 2050. So we have thousands of observations, roughly 2,000 in each. And so you can really see a correlation. It's significant, explains about 13%. You take the linear regression, this is logarithmic curve, that's why it's a curve axis. And so here, the message is positive. Then I looked at changes. Do you grow faster if you become urban faster? And here in the past, I had not found a significant correlation, but I could only go back to 1975. Now I can go back to 1950 and look at the growth rate over the entire period, 1950, 2015. But then you have far fewer observations, and I still found nothing significant. It's just a cloud. Change in urban doesn't really seem to be correlated with the growth rate of the economy. Change in city, again, doesn't really seem to be correlated with the change in economic growth. This is a first estimate. We're still improving the backcasting back to 1950. I'm also wondering whether agglomerations will help. Maybe it's more important that people get in big agglomerations, not all cities. So we'll keep looking at this. We might divide the period up in sub-periods to see whether we find something. But the correlation, if you use the national definition, is positive. Whereas here, we don't find significant impact. Last thing I want to talk about, keeping in mind that I don't walk long for too long, is how have cities changed? And here again, we enter into fraught waters, big discussions, because lots of people came to the conclusion that cities must be de-densifying. Places become richer, there's more infrastructure, densities must. We had a bit of a challenge. So we had 11,000 cities in 2020. And every 5 years, we had 10,000, 9,000, 8,000, 6,000 cities when you went back in time. But those were points in time. And you need to connect the dots, right? How do you connect all those cities across time? Usually it's easy. There was a city then, there's a city now, it's a one-to-one relationship. But cities don't always stay simple. They grow, they can shrink, they can merge, they can split, they can shift in location after a disaster, or they can die, they can shrink that they're no longer a city. So what we have done is we developed a system to link all those cities across time. And you can pick a reference here. You can pick today, you can pick a reference here in the past or in the future. And with that reference here, then we stop all merging and splitting. You're not allowed to do that. You're only allowed to grow or shrink, die or reborn. Why do we do that? It's because then we can have a clean relationship, a one-to-one relationship for all these different entities, and then you can follow them across time. If you want to know, are big cities growing faster than small cities, you need to be able to classify them by size, and then you need a one-to-one relationship. So here, for example, this is Atlanta, and you have a city there and a city there that was separate in 2020, in 2015, but we keep them together because they have joined up by 2020. Here you see a city that has been shrinking. These areas here outside the black border used to be part of the city. And here you have two cities that used to be together, but that today are separate, the black boundaries. So we divide them up. We split that city back in 2015 because it's not allowed to merge. And that allows us to follow cities through time. We wouldn't do that. You wouldn't know whether this city was growing faster or not because it didn't exist in the past, right? So it's one way of doing it. And it's particularly important for the large cities. So if you look at the small cities, almost all of them, 99% have this one-to-one relationship, right? Very easy. One city in 75, one city in 1980. If you look at the ones over 500,000, 2/3 of them have been created through mergers. So you need to decide, what do I do with all these different bits in the past? You know, you can't just ignore them. But for example, Jakarta, 1975, these were 10 or more different small cities that grew together. But we keep them together so that we can see how that has evolved over time. Depending on which reference here you pick, you get either more mergers and fewer splits. If you start in the past, you start in the today, you have fewer mergers but more splits. So we connected all our thousands of cities across time. Now we can check population density. At one point in time, that was easy, and it changes over time. So here we look over 20 years, which cities have become denser, and they're in brown, and which cities have lost density, they're in green. So you can see in Africa, all the larger cities there, density has gone up, but you can also see in China and in India, over that period, cities expanded quite quickly, and as a result, density has dropped. It's hard to come up with a single answer to whether cities have changed in terms of density or not, if you have very different patterns. Here we looked at all the small cities, and we mapped them in 75 and only concluded the cities that existed then. And you see that densities dropped according to this data. If you look at the big cities, you see that the densities went up substantially. Now, one of the difficulties with density is it's very hard to measure it for cities because if you use administrative boundaries, sometimes the boundaries are way too big, sometimes they're way too small. So what was the shortcut? They say, okay, density doesn't matter, but maybe density change matters. But if you look at the levels are so different, right? Average densities between 9 and 14,000 inhabitants per square kilometer in low income. In high income, it's just between 3 and 6. So radically different. I'm not sure the thing I'm most worried about, or the thing that's most significant, the changes in density. The levels are so radically different. Getting to the end of my presentation. You've all heard of skew distribution, right? Some rock stars or hip hop stars or rappers earn fortunes most of them earn peanuts, right? Cities, it's similar. You have a very small number, 1% are cities over 5 million, and you've got 65% small cities. You have that very skewed distribution. It really matters what you use when you're trying to produce averages. We look at land. Well, big cities cover a lot of land. They're large, but they're also, so you get it right here. 24% of land is covered by that 1% of cities. And that's because they're big. But because they're dense, they cover 32% of the total city population. So even more, right? What does that mean? It means that if you look at different densities in different ways, you'll get different results. So we look at it simple. The little blue line is the city average. Have densities gone up? Up. They've gone down over time. If you want to get the experience of the average city resident, then you say, oh, well, you know, what density do they live at? You do a population weighted average, and you see it goes up. You're curious about the most typical neighborhood weighted by land, it still goes up, but it's much lower because you give more weight to the low density cities, which cover more land. So simple answer, 3 different replies, all correct, but all about a different part of it. And again, for me, the changes are interesting, but the differences by income are far bigger than the changes over time. And so in low income countries, you see typically for all 3 measured densities go up. And this is because population is very quick and they don't have the investments and the capacity to actually build faster than they're growing. Lower middle and upper middle, fairly flat. You get a lot of newer cities that are lower density, they're small. And this is high income. A lot of talk about sprawl, but at the city level, in our data, we don't see a lot. But that's also because we look at the city. It might very well be if we look at agglomerations, we get radically different results. That's why I wanted to find this. Also by size, you typically find the bigger the city, the higher the density, very regular pattern here, not much change. But here you can really see the bigger cities, 1 and 5 million, skyrocketing. Back in 75, they didn't have cities over 5. And here again, it's the big cities that are growing most in terms of density. So, wrapping up, trying to tell you about the degree of urbanization, something that created collectively and is supported by a large number of international organizations, but also being implemented by many statistical offices. And I keep trying to engage with different ones. I had a meeting with the Japanese statistical office, I had a meeting with the Chinese statistical office, the Indian statistical office. And they're all very curious. We're also quite surprised by the differences at times. Korea has been publishing this for over a time series. They have grids going back in time. So more and more we see countries picking this up and using it. So I think it really makes it easier to get comparisons and to share boundaries. Nobody owns grid boundaries, but copyright limits access to municipal boundaries, to regional boundaries, etc. But the grid doesn't have that problem. So it makes it easier to collect data, to share data, and produce data for the same boundaries and understand how cities are changing and how we can compare. I know this was a complicated story, but the simple takeaway is what drives urbanization? It's not net migration. It's mostly natural change, followed by reclassification, which most people ignore because that's hard. If we look at impact on economic development, we find a correlation that places that are more urban have more higher GDP per capita, but the changes across time, I can't link them together. Again, maybe it's because I'm using the wrong concept. I'm not using functional urban areas or metropolitan areas because we don't have commuting over time. But maybe if we use agglomerations, focus on the large ones, we will still find that connection. So this is to be continued. And the last question, we're keep talking about de-densification, but I think what we tried to show here that many cities, especially large poor ones, have become even denser over time. To start off with, they were already incredibly dense. They don't necessarily look dense because they don't have these big towers. It just means that more and more people are crammed into very, very small. Okay. Just wanted to list you the last things we're gonna do. Continue to do, this is not a final product, we're still in the process. Defining an agglomeration, improving the data going back to 1950, help more countries to implement it, make changes. The semi-dense towns aren't perfect, so we're trying to improve them. We're working with a group of academics to project grids up to 2100. This is climate change, also to understand how cities might change. We'll report back to the UN Statistical Commission in 2026. And we're also hoping to develop a finer grid, a 100-meter grid, and apply the degree of urbanization to that. Because at 1 kilometer for big cities, the boundaries is pretty okay. But for smaller places, for towns and villages, we need a bit more resolution to really capture those smaller places. So that's why. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louis. So now I think I'll pass the floor to Vernon for comments on the presentation.
This is a presentation with a lot of details. I'll talk about all of those. You can see the slides. It's involved to some degree in some of this early on, so I know something about it. Before I sort of look at my specific comments, I'll say about a couple things that Louis said I want to emphasize. He, did talk about the continuum of different types of places. The demand in the world is to talk about urban and rural, and I'm going to talk somewhat about that, but recognizing that they've done this nice job of trying to think about a continuum of different types of settlements. The other thing is the density issue at the end, with these very high densities in developing countries and in cities and low income countries. That's really important. People living in the developed world have no clue what it's like to live with those kind of density because they're just not in those cities. And the densities are, people are consuming tiny amounts of space. There's a lot of issues to do, health issues, public health issues. A lot of issues of traffic congestion and so on. These are just very different places to exist in than what you experience in the developed world. So I've got a few little bones I'm going to pick with Louis, and that's going to be most of what I'm going to talk about. So Louis talked about the traditional definitions, and countries were originally struggling. What is urban? What are urban areas? And we want to define it according to how we feel about it nationally. So they want places to have an urban character as opposed to a rural character. And that's very subjective, and you can see how that would differ by country. So usually it was some kind of minimum population around some type of business district. You wanted the population to be non-agricultural largely. Often, and this is problematic as Louis pointed out, they wanted associated with some type of public facilities like transport nodes. That was in the UK definition for a long time, post offices and so on, which of course is something that are placed there and really have not to do with what the nature is. In recent decades, more of a focus of employing some type of density criteria, minimum density criteria, either for people or for buildings. Both are used. India here has the statutory but also census towns, so the census can kind of make up of the town greater than 5,000 people, not so different than this. Greater than 400, that should say people per square kilometer, and non-agricultural. So that became an issue. Now, if you go into Africa and the kinds of ways one might define cities in Africa as an academic, you will see that there's a large component of farm employment and out commuting, up to 40%. So if you employed India's criteria in Africa, you'd lose a lot of what would be middle and middle-sized cities would just disappear because they're inhabited by farmers. Density thresholds tend to vary by country, you know, the EU using the 300, India 400, China at times has set some quite high thresholds, maybe partly to underrepresent how urban the country is. A big issue in all this is that these definitions change a lot. So countries revise their definitions continuously, which means that there's very little consistency over time. So I was looking yesterday at the most recent definitions for the UK and the US, and they're different than they were 10 years ago. And so you're thinking, well, keep changing definitions, how do we do comparisons? Just a comment, and this is partly a vocabulary issue. What do we mean by urbanization? I think of urbanization as a process of countries moving from rural to urban, and that involving structural transformation, moving out of farming into activities that are not land intensive, that tend to agglomerate, such as manufacturing and business services in particular. And so we think of this process as going on in developing countries. That's a little different than, you know, Lewis is talking about how you reclassify, and which is really important, and with most growth in cities coming from natural growth and reclassification and migration not being so big a part of that. That's studies in China from 20 years ago making that point quite forcefully. Of course, we have this urbanization, but then you end up with developed countries like the US where there is no agriculture, right? It's still, current definitions, about 20% rural, historically more than that. And the rural sector doesn't really have farm employment. I mean, that's tiny in the US. It's manufacturing intensive. So what makes it rural? Well, it's not urban in character, right? It's kind of spread out. There's no focal center, stuff like that. So I'm going to talk now about this, the relative thing. Should every country have the same threshold? Should you do this the same for every country? And I'm going to make a case for relative, which is and a way to do it, which is which I think Lewis knew I would talk about, and then say, well, his answer would be that's not very practical, and that may be the case. Okay, so we think of a country that we have a composition of economic activities and people scattered across space, and then we just increase the population by densifying everywhere by the same amount. So you grow population on the same place. So then when you grow the population, you're going to cross thresholds. You're going to cross density thresholds. You're going to cross size thresholds. And population that before was rural now becomes urban, although people aren't doing anything different. You've held their composition. Or if you have two countries that have the same economic composition, but different national population densities, they're going to have different degrees of urbanization because you're crowding more people out of land. So, and you know, population densities, national ones vary enormously, right? India at 435 nationally on average, UK 277, USA 35. Some countries go down to 9 or 10. So I mean, there's enormous differences in the intensity and sizes of country in terms of their population relative to land. And you might think that these countries would think what kind of thresholds to have as being different, right? Based still on the idea that, yeah, we want to think of urbanization related to the nature of the activity, the agglomeration of manufacturing and services, things like that. So this is a statistical criteria that Lewis referred to. These folks published this paper. They have a bunch of ongoing work based on French data using buildings. We've applied this to Africa using the GHS data on population and on built volume, and also on cover. So the way that these folks do it is they have pixels, just like Lewis does. They rank all the pixels by either population density or, in the French case, building density. And then they take all the case, either all the population or all the buildings in the country, and they just throw it at the map, what's called the dartboard approach, right? So it lands and splatters randomly across the country. And then they're looking at unusual concentrations in that random pattern and saying, well, if you're above some threshold, like the top 5% of what occurs randomly, doing this process many, many times, then maybe we'll think of that as being urban. And that's what they do in this case, in the French case, and what we do in Africa as well. And then you've got then these pixels that have more than expected, if you like, or random density. And you cluster those then into cities, the ones that are contiguous together, and that's how you form your cities. And then if you want, you can take all your urban pixels and look at the most dense of those and define an urban core, since people like having cores. So that's kind of in 30 seconds what they've spent years doing. So when they do this for France, the official definition of France is 82% urban. They get 74% of people in urban areas, about 6,000 of them. And then 70% of the population lives in cities with an urban core, so in only 800 of these. So it's a way of doing it. It doesn't have any lower real threshold on population other than a minimum density and grid square, that's your threshold. It is a relative thing, so the countries that are denser are going to have higher thresholds to be urban. And for African countries where we've done this, you look across these thresholds that come out in this process versus their national density, and there's a really strong correlation. I'd love to know, for example, what we find for India. So India is 35% urban. You have it about 70 or something. I mean, really high. If you did this random process, what would you come up with? I don't know. I'm be really curious to know. So so I am going to say one thing about all this work that Lewis didn't talk about. You got these grid squares. They have a population. Where does that come from? I mean, the national statistics aren't giving you population in grid square. Typically, what they have is data at a district level, a county level, a state level, a provincial level of what the population is. And then they've got to take that data and smear it, across this province or district into these grid squares. And you could do it uniformly, but that doesn't make sense. So what they do is they use the built environment or a record of the built environment. So you have different types of images and with different resolutions. They're using relatively low resolution images, originally 30 meter by 30 meter resolution, and now I guess form 10 meter by 10 meter. It's not 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter, the really super clear satellite data. And they're smearing people into these grid squares according to where the built environment is. But of course, with this built environment, trying to distinguish with this resolution between residential space, commercial space, public space is hard. I mean, try to make a distinction. So we do know that in this work that the finer the population is released to you by the National Statistical Bureau, the finer the spatial resolution that they're giving you population at, the much more accurate you are in doing this exercise. That seems to be really critical. So if you're getting data at the provincial level, you're kind of in trouble when you do the smearing. If you're getting it down at a ward level or something, much better shape. So of course, if you can coordinate with countries, then they could give you very detailed information provided they have the census. So I this thing of how we populate the grid squares is something that's always worried me. The people doing it, I mean, there's a lot of machine learning and ground truthing and where they do know the information and then trying to apply that to other areas. People doing it, I really like them. They're very dedicated and super, they want to do a good job. But there's not a lot of publication on it. It's not subject to a lot of scientific scrutiny, and I wish it was subject to more. I wish it was more transparent process. I know that there are fix-ups that go on when things kind of go awry, and it's not always clear what those fix-ups are. That said, we use their product, so I guess it's there. So I like a statistical definition. I like the this way of thinking of relative. I understand that's not very saleable, probably. And so it may not be so practical. The advantage of the EU work is this consistency over time and space, even if it negates different countries' desire to figure out what is urban for them. But I wish that some of this had a more scientific evaluation. So those are mine.
Take your seat over there.
Okay.
Now we're going to open the floor to questions. Who would like to start? Yes, go ahead, please. Say your name and
my name is Matt. I'm on the RUPS course. You didn't speak as much about like the types of industry as Professor Henderson did. So I'm just curious does that play a role in the data, and like you're looking at how cities grow or shrink over time, but I'm just curious how that plays a role and if that may impact whatever policy comes out of your analysis.
Sure, I can try and answer that question. The thing I'm most interested in about industry is, when we talk manufacturing, is how its spatial distribution changes over time. My expectation would be that it starts in or near big cities and ports, but as those places grow and become more expensive and become more congested, the transport infrastructure in the rest of the country improves. You get a decentralization of industry and manufacturing, and that actually helps to reduce some of the differences in income between different parts of the country, between urban and rural, between large cities and small cities. If you look in Europe at where manufacturing is located, it's often in rural, non-agricultural business, close to a highway or close to a railway line or a port. And because communication is quite efficient, transport infrastructure is high quality, the benefit of trying to locate that close to a large metropolitan area is much lower. With the World Bank, we've been trying to find different ways of monitoring that across time. And that's really the big challenge. Yes, there are 40-centimeter resolution imagery today, which we didn't use because they're really expensive, but we don't have them for the past, right? So we're looking for how can you get that over time? And that's really a challenge, and that's when you end up working with force data, trying to estimate, is that a big building now, i.e. probably manufacturing? Was it a big building back then? Was it there back then? So that's really the challenge. And for me, that's really one of the interesting parts, because I actually think it holds a key to changing spatial development of the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a paper in the US where people go back in time by using aerial photo data. And then show what the development is for the US between 1970 and about 2000. But, most countries don't have those aerial photos, and those are super high resolution. That's unusual.
Okay. Anyone else? If not, let me just say, I mean, I love what you're doing in general, but I think so much into both of you. And to have this sort of clear definition of what a city is and consistent over time, etc. But why is it so important to measure whether we are in a city or in a rural area or in a peri-urban area? What is the point of all this exercise?
Now you're gonna distribute your resources. People live in cities, they need more infrastructure, because they're more congested, and they need more relative investments in transport infrastructure, and clean water and sewage and stuff like that. Don't need that in so much in rural areas, not so much per capita. It's policy around.
Yeah, for me, it kind of helps guide my expectations, right? If you're living in a big city and half of the population doesn't have access to clean water, you know, my first question is why not? You know, you're living in a big city. You have enough people here to justify the necessary investments to make sure you have things. And it'd be cost effective to do it there. If you're in the deep countryside and it's difficult to get clean water, that's less of a surprise, right? You know it's hard. You know it's going to cost a lot of money. It's poor. So for me, it helps set what I would expect. And the other thing for me is that it structures so many things. Here, I didn't show a lot of indicators by degree of urbanization, but you know, you can throw any survey into the degree of urbanization, and you'll get significant differences, whether it's employment, education, happiness, poverty, country of birth, you know, simple in Europe, it's very simple. You take the share of population born abroad in rural areas, you double it, you get the share in towns, you double it again, you get it in cities, right? So it really is a very powerful way of analyzing the territory that shows patterns that otherwise would be completely invisible. So for me, it really is revealing. For example, poverty in Europe follows a very strange pattern. In rich countries, it's higher in cities, and in poor countries, it's higher in rural countries. In cities, you get a concentration of unemployed in the city centers, so poverty rates are a bit higher. Whereas you have a lot of unemployment and low wage jobs in rural areas in poor countries, so that's why you get more poverty. So yeah, I just think it's something that for policy, but also for the underlying situation. And it also totally changes how you can fix it. If I tell you that, you know, in rural France, access to public transport is not very good, you're not going to be surprised, but it's also, you're not going to be surprised because it's really hard to fix it, right? If you tell you, hey, there's crappy access to public transport in Paris or London, yes, you're going to be surprised, right? So these concepts kind of shape your expectations because those concepts also determine the costs of providing those services. So that's why it's important.
I'm happy that I'm getting you on a middle ground with my question, but of course it's policy relevant and I can understand. And the definition of a city, if you are in a city, you get different types of resources that you are in a rural area. But my concern is not whether you are in the core of a city or you are in a very low dense area. My concern is that you had 6,000 cities 40 years ago, and now you have almost double that size. And even if you throw them at a dartboard, you're going to have that. So is crossing a small threshold, does it make that much of a difference? Although in terms of policy and revenues and actual investment, it would make a significant difference, despite the fact you're more or less where you were, somewhere in between.
Right, but you densified, right? So because you densified, you know, what you need to move through space, which you need to keep yourself healthy and so on changes, and that's part of the public policy. So it has changed.
I think at the margin, I agree with you, Anders, that it doesn't make any difference. You know, if you're a town of 45,000 and all of a sudden you're a city of 51,000, nothing has really fundamentally changed. But for me, it's not really at the margin. It's really being able to look at the entire continuum. And for each city, you have an individual size that you can track over time. And I think we're all going to agree that a city of 5 million is fundamentally different than a city of 50,000 or than a village of 500, right? So it's really in those bigger jumps. And the thing that has surprised me is that even though we use explicit threshold, the situation only changes relatively slowly. Only in countries where things really, population growth is super high, do you get rapid changes. But the overall stability of a place is very high. And once it becomes a city, it stays a city. So in the end, reclassification matters, but especially in places where you see a lot of population change and a lot of expansion.
On one of the things that struck me, and struck me strongly, is that in your classification of types of settings by levels of development, there was not much difference. There had been convergence in the end between the low middle income, the high middle income, and the high income. The one that stood out by quite some margin, as also Vernon, I think, mentioned it very clearly, are the low income countries. Whereas there's a much lower level of urbanization there. Cities are far denser, and density is growing at a phenomenal rate. Do you have any concerns about that? What are the problems? What can we find a solution? Because these are also the areas of the world where you still have the highest population growth, which is the main driver in the cities. But also you have probably the biggest problems of survival and security in many rural areas that would push many of those inhabitants in cities. What sort of solutions can you propose, or what can be done in order to make sure that we have an orderly urbanization?
I mean, the problem is they're low income countries. They're urbanizing, getting these dense populations. We think of institutions developing with economic growth. Their institutional situation is not great. They have pretty weak institutions, and think of a city of 20 million. You want a sewer system. The city not have a sewer system. You want a public transport, and it's a money issue, right? So people are coming into cities, especially in Africa, at very low income levels compared to one city. People urbanize in other parts of the world, and it's an enormous challenge. Conditions are really bad.
I mean, in addition to seeing, fairly low share of population in cities, and they're being very dense, they're also typically quite small. So the share of population living in small cities of the city population is quite high. They don't have large cities. The ones they do are super dense and lack a lot of the services that you would expect. I mean, typically there's been a lot of debate about trying to slow down urbanization. I think that's a waste of money. Trying to pay people to stay in the countryside for the reasons you cited is again a horrible idea. So for me, acknowledging that these cities will grow in population and in space, and that's not the end of the world, is a good way to start. Acknowledging that these cities should build out and up. I mean, their population growth is so high, their densities are so high that we shouldn't have this idea of trying to constrain them, like with a green belt, like around London. I truly think that for developing countries, absolutely horrible ideas. There's still this rhetoric that cities shouldn't be allowed to de-densify. If you look at those densities, I think having them de-densify would help to put in roads, to put in sewers, to put in public transport. So it would mean that they need to invest more, but they might actually didn't have the space that is needed for those services. So for me, I really struggle with this idea that denser is always better. Especially when I look at low income cities, but it's a mantra in the planning world. There's this belief that we shouldn't de-densify because it will be horrible for everybody. Actually, there, I tend to disagree.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Any other questions? Yes, Monica.
Monica, I'm doing a local economic development course here at LSE. So I just had a question on, in the absence of final geographical data, I mean, what are your thoughts on using NIFLEX data for estimation of urbanization? Would that be an nice way to go about it?
I think we just have, we did that historically because it was data that was available, but, there was so much blooming and the lights that spreading out of the lights are, and we have data on the built environment and so where we can track the process of where building is occurring. So I mean, night lights is a simple thing to use and has that advantage, but we have much better data now for delineating areas and thinking about. I mean, night lights does give you some intensity and newer night lights data since 2000, whatever, 11 and 12, which is sometimes hard to get out of building data because you've got to do the heights, and we're improving our ability to estimate heights and to get volume, and that's effective with the GHS, and it'll get better over time. So I think it's better to use data on the built environment.
You know, I would agree. I think our data on building footprints, not just from DHSL, but also from building footprint data. Google and Microsoft, they've released various sources where you can get outlines of buildings or estimates of that. I think that's much better. Wanted to add two more things. One on India. The question that I want to add to your question. Yes, I would like to know what the dartboard method would do, but I would also like to know what would happen in India if they took away the requirement of agricultural employment. I've asked some people in India and they got different results, but have been boosted from 35 at least to 50, maybe even 60 or 70% the share in what they call urban. So, you know, I would definitely like to see that. On the scientific scrutiny, there's a paper in preparation that should answer at least some of your questions.
It took a long time.
It took them a very long time. And then with regard to population disaggregation, I think I agree with everything you said. It really depends very much on the spatial resolution of your input data. And sometimes that's coarse and you're going to get worse results. So for me, the GHS POP is the second best. The best is the country themselves producing data by squares. And there's a growing number of countries that are actually producing data for those squares. Europe does it, but also Japan, Korea, US could do it, Canada could do it, Mexico has done it, Colombia is doing it. So whenever you have a geocoded census, basically you get a dot on a map for every single person that replied, right? And if you want data by squares, you just add the dots in the squares, so it can be done. But here's my question for you. Knowing that the data of population is sometimes coarse, knowing that it's imperfect, I would still argue it's better to use population than buildings, because I think buildings are so different from one.
But if you're doing a course and you're doing your population by smearing it into buildings, I don't know. You don't use the buildings because
because the ratio of building square meters to person differs radically between one country and another.
Oh, right, yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
So for me, using population is intrinsically more comparable across countries or across continents than buildings would be.
Yeah, but okay, but if you use like a dartboard approach where it's a relative standard, right? In some sense it can be.
Let me push back on this one. So because this one for me is interesting.
I mean, I'm just thinking if I'm looking at a particular country, right, and I'm getting local population by smearing it into buildings, why don't I be able to do it? So that's effectively what I'm doing.
Well, because even within a country, the amount of buildings occupied by, square meters of building built up area per capita changes radically.
But you're assigning it still, right, according to the buildings. What you see is the footprint of the building, so you're assigning it. So you can talk about population, but you're really talking about buildings.
If we had only national population, yes.
Yeah, okay. You're saying you've got the regional, so maybe
and that's some variation. But so here, I've heard the argument that, countries with lots of space. Have lower density cities, and that makes total sense, right? America, classic example, lots of open space, that's why their cities are lower density. Australia, lots of space, lower density. I've always struggled with that, because for me, what matters to a city is how much land is around it. And that doesn't change. It doesn't change if you think about Alaska. It doesn't change that there's this huge amount of desert in the interior of Australia. The amount of land and 50 kilometers around the city is the same everywhere in the globe.
Right, so we think of the new world, which you're describing, is looking spatially different than the developed part of the old world, because a lot of the old world developed before there were cars or the core parts of cities, right? They develop with, with public transport systems and so on, even within the US, if you do the East Coast, Boston, New York versus the West, it's very different. And partly it's just this history that's driving this difference.
So your argument that this is about the amount of the density of a country is completely.
Well, I'm not thinking, there's no density in North America, right? Well, if you're comparing, you're picking India versus similar low density Africa, right? What you think of in 300 people per square meter in India can be very rural. What we could, in my eyes, of what is the nature of rural, right?
But I still feel that by using, if you say it has to be non-agricultural, you're gonna make it much easier to find an economic link, right?
Well,
Because-
I don't, yeah, I'm obviously, I worry about imposing the non-agricultural part and so on. I'm just saying that you've got areas that seem rural. You would think of it, they don't have agglomeration, they don't have services, and they cross a density threshold just because it's a very dense country, and we call those urban, and another place we don't. So, yeah, we can go around it.
And yeah, you wanted to ask a question.
Hello, my name is Amantika. I'm doing LAD at LSE. My question to you is you have mentioned about the disagreement on deurbanizing the city. So what do you think of the population, cities like Mumbai, where there is a chunk of population living in slums without any proper sanitation or health or education system? Do you still think that you should not just focus on deurbanizing, but because the implementation and the institutions are not working very effectively in that place? So coming back to the rural areas where they were originally from and creating resources in that area so that they can develop well without any pressure in such a small space, living in like 2x3 room, something like that.
So you're advocating that they go back to the rural area?
And so I want to know, I want to ask about your thoughts on this. Like, do you think that it
They're
may
in
be
cities for economic opportunities because they're agglomeration and their jobs, and they're better off than almost by definition that they're there than when you do have a village to go back to. They choose not to go back to that because of being able to earn more money in the city, and possibly not so much the case maybe in India, better schooling. I'm not saying that's the case, but it can be in some countries, right? So they want to be in the cities. I don't want to tell them not to be there. And
Of course
they're not being, I don't think they're not making irrational choices or something. They're there for
yeah, of course
they're trying to improve their lives, right?
they have made their own choices by staying in the cities, even if it's slum. But what about the basic facilities they have been deprived of? Even if they are living in cities, they are getting 2 times meal. But what about the children who have been deprived of?
No, I agree. The living conditions can be really bad, and I don't wanna come in and say you can't be in these cities. Right, and so, you know, they love their children, it's part of their calculus about what are the advantages and disadvantages. You know, in some cases, in some countries, they just think, well, their kids are gonna get a much better education if they're in the city, even if the way they're living is not great. They were back in the farm, their kids might be a little healthier, or might have, certainly have more space and stuff like that, but family wouldn't have as many jobs and kids wouldn't have as good schooling. So, no, I don't want to de-urbanize them.
Occasionally we disagree, but this time I'm gonna mostly agree. I also don't want to second guess their choices, right? They make choices based on what's best for them or what they think is best for them. I'm not sure I would know any better. But let me take a slightly different tack. I mean, I don't think the goal of public policy should be to determine where people live. But I do think the goal of public policy should be to improve the quality of wherever people live. Some places it's harder to improve quality of life, more expensive. So it's logical to maybe start with the places where it's cheapest. But it doesn't necessarily have to stop there. If you look at life satisfaction in rich European countries, it's highest in the countryside. They live in a large house, they can drive everywhere, they've got services close by, which are probably subsidized by people living in the city. But you know, countryside doesn't have to mean poverty or deprivation. It can also become an extremely pleasant place to live. The bit where it's unclear to me whether this is a logical outcome of development or it's a luxury that only rich countries can afford, but the jury is still out. But I think, you know, once you can definitely also ensure that people living in the countryside have good access to services, maybe not the same, but maybe the equivalent, and have a high standard of living.
So we're over time now, but I can just not avoid asking one question, which is about the politics and the policy process. You started in this with this, I think it was 2016, if you said I understood it right. And this has been adopted by international organizations, but now it's been implemented. Where are you finding the biggest support and where are you finding the biggest barriers?
Find the biggest support in countries who are not satisfied with their current definition. If they're looking at and they say, yeah, this doesn't work, and they're interested in alternatives, then very often they go and look like, well, this is a pretty decent alternative. So France, Tunisia, they are turning this into Turkey, they will turn this into their national definition. So that is, Korea doesn't even have a definition, so we're like, oh, this is useful, we can use that. Some countries where I get a lot of resistance are twofold. Countries where money is tied to urban and rural status, and India would be a good example of that. You get a lot of subsidies if you're rural, so the incentive to stay rural is very clear. And also in places where, for them, urbanization is very much about the lifestyle, the urban way of life, the presence of services, and trying to tell them, listen, we don't want to look at that ahead of time. We want to first find out where are the people concentrated and only then check which services they have or lack. And that is a struggle. That's a struggle because it requires a reframing of the debate. But for me, it's a critical one because then it can help saying, okay, which places should we prioritize? Well, we start with which cities or which towns lack these and these services, right? So for me, it's a useful reframing of the question. And then the last thing I'll say, the most curious thing that I noticed was in the debate, I get a lot of criticism for having a different definition. Got criticism from Canada. And then you find out actually that they don't have a national definition, but it changes from province to province. Also in the UK, they change definitions all the time, but it's actually a different one in Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. I mean, guide that, you know. Sure, you can define it in a different way, every census and every different region of your country. In Egypt, it's different in every governorate. But then it becomes very difficult to talk about the same thing.
Okay, so thank you very much to both of you for a very interesting. Something, and many of you would like to see Lewis tomorrow, so we're meeting with him in the CKK at 10 a.m. So talking about what do we owe places. I don't know what we owe places. And tomorrow in the evening, there's another meeting, another event by the Cañada-Blanch Centre. We're hosting the Spanish ambassador to the UK, going to talk about the future in this turbulent world, and especially relationships between Spain and the UK. So thank you very much, and see you at the next meeting. Thank you.
It's great because.
That's great at the end.
That's always good. Oh, no. So it's really positive. So